In the last video, we completed the definition of the particle object. It is now time to add these particle objects to the engine or to the simulation. So we are now going to return to the header file of the engine. And here, I'm going to include the particle class. Okay. At some point, I will need to access these particle objects directly. So it'd be a good idea for me to create some type of list that will just hold these objects, some array perhaps. So what I'm going to do here is include a QList. And I'll use QList to store my particles. QList is going to hold particle pointers. Okay, and I'm going to call this array particles. Excellent. So let's move on to the engine source file. Now in the source file is where the magic will happen. So I'm going to use the spawn method that we added to the header file in the first video of this series. In this spawn method, I'm just going to use a for loop to create multiple particle objects and add those to the scene. Using a for loop, say for, let's say integer I starting at 0 and go until I, as long as I is less than the number in the argument, and just increase by 1. We will first need to just make some random positions and maybe just a diameter for these particles. We're going to make a particle pointer. So there's our pointer. Let's call this obj for object. Okay, and we're going to say new particle x, y, b, and d. Alright, what we have to do after that is store this particle inside of the particles array that we have in the header file. So I'm just going to call that array, and I'm just going to pass this object to the end of that array. Right, and what I'll do next is just say scene add item, and this is where we add our custom particle object that we have just created. So here I'll say particles dot last. The reason I'm saying last is because last should be the one that I just added to it, to this array. And it should be now in your scene. Now this is just a definition, so we have to include it somewhere. We have to run this somewhere, so I will just run that in the constructor right here. In the constructor, I'm going to say spawn, and for now I'm just going to want maybe 5 of these objects. Okay, so 5 particles should be created in the beginning of this program in the constructor. Okay, now if I go ahead and run this, you will see 5 particles in this engine or in this scene. Now the particles themselves are actually not moving, even though they have a velocity in a position, right? They have a position and the velocity is supposed to be added automatically to this position. They don't seem to be moving, however, because the advance member function of these particles is not being called anywhere. So in order to fix that, we're going to use the timer that belongs to the engine, which we have defined here. We're going to say connect. Okay, I'm going to say every time the timer times out, so the signal is going to be timeout. And we're going to tell the scene to advance every object, every QGraphics object with this method. So the slot will be called advance. And there we have it. Now before I run this, I must start the timer. So I should say timer.start. And I'm going to use the number 17 roughly, because that's close to about 60 frames per second. If you run this now, the object is not going to move, and that's because I forgot one thing in the particle definition, or actually in the advanced definition. So after you add the vectors, you have to make sure that our particle knows that it needs to update. So let's type that in there. Update. So let's try that again. I'm going to do 5 of these objects. And you can see the objects moved. And we can see a clear trail of all of the paintings. If we want to avoid this, what we have to do is also reset the background of our scene. Let's add a method called refresh. Let's add that into protected slots. And this one's going to be as easy as just refreshing the background. So let's do void refresh bg. Okay, let's define that. And all we're going to do is actually take this command that I have up here, and let's pass that in there. Now in order to execute this refresh background method, I have to connect that to the timer as well. So to do that, I'm just going to copy this line, paste it there, and when the timer sends a timeout signal, we're going to tell this to run the refresh background member function. There you go. So let's try that again. And it looks a lot nicer.